Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. Now today happens to be the World Mental Health Day. Okay, so it fits in very nicely with the last few podcasts that I've been doing on defining what mental health is as opposed to psychological disorders or distress. And so in the course of our podcasts, or my podcast, but I'm hoping you're nicely involved with it, so it's a bit of a we thing, I basically implicitly gave you a framework that creates a sense of what mental health, mental well-being rests on. And as I said, it's not simply mental. Our mental well-being requires us to be physically as well as we possibly can. So the framework that I work with is that it's a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in that it's a hierarchy. So the bottom is our physical well-being, so taking care of our sleep, exercise, relaxation, nutrition. The second part of it is our psychological well-being. What is it that we experience mentally? So our thoughts, our feelings, beliefs, values, attitudes, our self-talk, our relationship with ourselves. And then the other aspect to it is the more social aspect. In other words, my behaviour within my world, within my sphere of influence. And that sphere of influence can be very different for very different people. If you happen to be very, very famous, or you happen to be in a highly influential position, your sphere of influence is going to be significantly greater than that of, say, a person who doesn't have that sort of position. So, what's the pinnacle of this hierarchy? Now, Maslow talks about self-actualization, and in the hierarchy that I've put together is that the top of the pyramid, as it were, is essentially our spiritual being. How are we spiritually? Now, I'm going to make it very clear at this point that I am not talking about religion. Okay, so I've trolled the internet to see what's on the various web pages about the difference between spirituality and religion, and I found a few. And it's interesting how different a lot of them are. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them because I think that would defeat the purpose, really. In essence, I'd like you to hear and think about what I'm describing, and then possibly see how you can align your views, your perception about what your spirituality may really be about. Now, one of the things that I find is that we don't have a binary approach to this, okay? So I want to make it very clear that however you define religion and however you define spirituality, the two can be found within each other. Now, the thing that I find probably most interesting is that within religious practice, I would like to think that there is a deeper seated spirituality. But unfortunately, my observation and also, what I'm seeing and hearing from a lot of people, that's not always the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't have things like sexual abuse within the Christian religions, probably all the religions, but that's a particularly big one, and we had a royal commission into this, and it was particularly disturbing. Not simply from the point of view of what the victims endured, but also what it fundamentally means about an institution that is held in such esteem, generally speaking, and that has such powerful influence unfortunately politically, but also in our education system. Many of the top schools are essentially deeply embedded in a religious faith. Now, I'm not going to get into any debate or arguments about the pros and cons of that. I'm wanting to focus on helping everybody on this World Mental Health Day to think about that aspect, which is the cherry on top. And that's how I want to approach it. The pinnacle of aligning ourselves in the areas that we need to be aligned in. So let me define in one way the idea of religion so that we can get a sense of the differences and possibly similarities. Religion is concerned with the faith in the claims of one faith tradition or another, an aspect of which is the acceptance of some form of heaven or nirvana and a deity. Connected with this are religious teachings or dogmas like ritual prayer and services and so on. Okay, so that's one definition that I ran across. Okay, now there's lots of others. I'm not going to go really into them. In this particular context, the way that the person defined spirituality is that it's concerned with those qualities of the human spirit, such as love, compassion, patience, tolerance, forgiveness, contentment, a sense of responsibility, a sense of wholeness and harmony. And they top it off with which brings happiness to both self and others. Now, the reason why I stayed with that particular definition was that it quite resonated for me. I'm not, by definition, a religious person. I'm not a believer in the sort of traditional deity. So when, in my early youth, and I'm talking about adolescence and young adulthood, I started thinking more and more about this issue. I found that to be able to conceptualize a deity, I just couldn't do that. But I also had a sense that there was something bigger than me. And one of the things that I came to explore very closely was Buddhism, and Zen Buddhism in particular. And in that process, one of the things that I discovered was that those values and qualities that were embedded within that tradition and also other spiritual traditions, which are the ones that I spoke about just then, were fundamental. So for me, spirituality became an area in my life that I could define by my values, which would shape my behaviour. So one of my values that emerged during this period of deep reflection has continued to shape myself and my behaviour towards others is essentially to do no harm. And also to practice a deep, deep-seated sense of compassion, contentment, responsibility in the sense that I will take ownership for both my strengths but also my weaknesses. And if I have unwittingly harmed someone, will make amends for that as much as possible. So the idea of mental health and spirituality for me in my life is actually very closely intertwined. I often talk about some of the dis-ease that I see in the people that I work with and in the community around me has a lot to do with a disconnection. And firstly, it's the disconnection in myself, from myself, and then secondly, the disconnection with others. And that includes the environment. So it's not just my disconnection, my sense of alienation or isolation from other human beings, but also from the environment, the natural environment. So, I think it's critical that if we're going to have an impact on psychological disorders and diseases or disturbances, we need to factor into that practice, into that way of thinking, into that approach, the notion of wholeness, the spirituality of it. And within that sense of wholeness, we need to understand that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, I'm not just a set of chemicals, or I'm not just behaviours, but I'm more than that. And I am part of something. So, I dug a little bit more around the place, and interestingly enough, I found the webpage for the Royal College of Psychiatry, and it actually has a page on it titled Spirituality and Mental Health. And they sort of talk about, spirituality being something that everyone can experience, and I particularly like that, because it helps us to find meaning and purpose in the things we value. It can bring hope and healing in times of suffering and loss, and it encourages us to seek the best relationship with ourselves, others, and what lies beyond, whatever that is. So I think that that's a very important fit, especially in the climate of the world today. We really need to think about what is it that we value and cherish, and how do we become stewards of that as opposed to owning it. Because owning things has not made any one of us any happier, more content, or more satisfied with living. I know the things that give me an absolute joy is watching my grandchildren, my children, how they now parent their children, the community at large. And yes, in that community at large, I find many sources of potential frustration. And there are times when I'm not mechanical. I'm not devoid of feeling anger and frustration. And for those of you of the Christian faith, you will understand very clearly that neither was Jesus, nor was Buddha. We need to experience those emotions, however, in a way in which they don't dictate our actions, especially if the intensity of those negative feelings increases, or we become particularly attached to them. So in that context, I want to challenge everybody on this World Mental Health Day to really examine your day-to-day practices that could fall under this category of spiritual or spirituality. Okay, those of you who are religious, I'm not taking away from that. I'm saying I'd like to see if you could add to it. So what might those things be? Well, one of the things is especially important, I think, is our participation within our community. And some of that may be somewhat ritualistic, symbolic practices, certain forms of worship. And it doesn't necessarily mean worship in a church or a temple or a mosque or, in a specific place. As a surfer, I often talk about one of the most spiritual experiences that I can have is to feel that sense of oneness and alignment with the ocean, being embraced by the ocean. So, to me, that is a place of worship. It might be going on retreats. Sometimes, in the way that our culture has accelerated into a madness, a frenzy, I think that going away and detaching ourselves from the things that keep us preoccupied and busy is a really important aspect. So no phones, no iPads, no notebooks, no radios, no nothing. Just you and nature. Also, I think it's really important, especially those who are working in the field of taking care of others, is that you need to include in that acts of compassion, firstly for yourself, but also for others. So that could be, for example, regular periods of meditation, relaxation, or deep reflection. Sometimes that can be enhanced by things like yoga, tai chi, or something similar. Now, one of the particular ones that I enjoy is music. So both listening to it, but also playing it. My background is playing percussion. So, there are times when I pick up my djembe, or, although I need a new conga, I'm putting that out there into the universe, to play with that, to get back into that sense of rhythm and beat. So there's lots of things that we can do in this space that will enhance that. Now, as a therapist, I'm also someone who's very keen on introducing, without tapping into religion, the notion of understanding my spiritual self. And so one of the things that I think is really, really important is the practice of mindfulness and the capacity to utilize that as a therapeutic medium, and putting it together with other types of therapies. Now, I'm, by definition, a humanistic existentialist, so I'm particularly interested in the whole experience, the whole of the human experience in being and not just doing. So that's particularly a part of my work that I keep fostering and keep nurturing and keep growing. And so there's lots of different therapies. Gestalt therapy is one of those. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is another. In addictions or independency work, we talk about, the 12-step program, so AA, NA. They have, a very strong both spiritual and religious aspect to it, although you can practice all of that without religion. And there are now also support groups in the addictions that, are essentially devoid of this sort of concept of a higher power and are based more on the sort of practical aspects that we have from psychology in general, that are more goal-directed. But I believe that in order to really heal an addiction, we need not just to heal the body, the mind, but we also need to heal the spirit, because an addiction frequently has a deep-seated spiritual rift involved and disturbs and distresses the person significantly. So I hope this was useful. Right now I'm going to then later on depart from the sort of whole mental health aspect, and I'm going to change tracks a little bit. So the next podcast I will be doing will be further conversations with my wife. So I'm really hoping that you've enjoyed the podcast so far, and that you'll continue to subscribe to the podcast and continue to listen, and hopefully be inspired to create some constructive changes in your life, and those are the ones who are important to you as well. Until next time, I'm signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.